Artaxerxes was the son of King Darius. Welcome to those that I think we are going live now. We're talking about Esther today. But the story begins with the king holding a celebration for 100 magnificent splendor of his greatness. By the way, I didn't say it, but you can turn to Esther if you want to. We're starting in 1 and we will move through all 9. At that time. So people were like, oh, they're exaggerating. Well, not necessarily. If he wasn't fighting a war, which apparently he had just gotten done with fighting a battle with a war with the Greeks, what else did he have to do with all his wealth and everything else that was there? Was celebrate and have a good time. But apparently it was kind of a running celebration in the entire kingdom for about half a year. But at the end of that celebration, he had a week-long banquet within the city of Susa, the capital where he was at, for all those who lived in Susa. And Scripture tells us that the wine flowed, and each person was served whatever they wanted, and there were no restrictions. So guess what? Alcoholism didn't start in the modern world. I would think that when there are no restrictions, there were probably people that were fond of it there as well, including the king himself. But on the 7th day of the banquet, again, king's all about me. On the 7th day of the banquet, apparently the king was feeling pretty good about himself, and he ordered his eunuchs who personally served him to bring his wife, Queen Vashti, in all her fine garments so that he could show her off. I mean, if you got it, flaunt it. I was always proud to be, and still am, was proud to have my wife on my arm, to be with her. It used to be kind of weird because we would go places and my wife's personality is quite a bit different than mine. You might not believe it now, but I'm not one that kind of steps out in the front of things. My wife wants to talk with everybody, and I would find a place, a chair, a couch, whatever, in the corner if we were at apartments or whatever, and let her do her thing and enjoy it. And she'd come see me every once in a while. And I'll be honest with you, it was prideful, I got to admit it. But when she'd come over and sit down and talk with me for a little bit, made me feel good. It's like, yeah, she's with me. Well, guess what? The king was the same thing. And apparently he had the choice of his women, so have no doubt that she also was attractive. Like I said, the king called for his eunuchs to bring them to him. The term eunuch was actually derived from a Greek word, because we hear this a good bit, particularly in Esther, was from a Greek term, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it literally means bed guard. One of the social functions performed by the eunuchs of that time was to protect royal or aristocratic women and their quarters and serve at their behest. They were usually assigned by the kings. Eunuchs were also frequently employed as court officials, often of very high rank, feeling that the king that could trust them. And we'll go into that just a hair more in just a second. But when the king called for the queen to come before him so that he could show her off, she refused. Now remember, we've had discussions about kings and what their authority and their power is for however many weeks. You don't refuse the king. And we'll get in more of what is power and what the traditions were of that time. People didn't refuse the king, particularly his wife. At his word, people lived and died. And I saw Sharon do this. It's exactly correct. He had that power. Literally at his word, people lived and died. You could even be killed if you came into the presence of the king without being summoned, just for showing up, which is part of what we'll discuss here in just a little bit. King wasn't too happy about it. He asked his advisors and his wise men what they thought he ought to do, because that's what they did then. They always asked their advisors, they consulted, they talked to their wise men, their whatever. But I think that there was wisdom involved in just that, because instead of going off half-cocked, because if I had that power back then, and I'm not saying I would do that, I hope that I would not be like this king or any of the other kings the way that they acted many times. Because he had the power, she refused him. I'm surprised he didn't just go ahead and have her axed or hung or whatever right there. But he didn't. He talked to his wise men first. And the wise men, being wise that they were, said, you can't let this happen. And you want to know why he said you can't let this happen?
Because all them other women going to follow her.
That's exactly it. It's not just because the king got disobeyed, but if she's allowed to get away with this, then all the other royal wives and all the other, your counselors and everything else, and I think there was 100+ satraps around all these people serving here, all these uppity women are going to think they can get away with not doing what their husband tells them to do, and when they call, they aren't going to come. So she can't be allowed to get away with this. Again, surprising, but he chose not to have her killed at that time. He was worried, and his counselors, because the king had the authority to do it, but the counselors were worried about what their women were going to do. Can I have somebody read Esther 1:19 for me, please?
If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and of the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she.
Surprising he didn't have her killed, but at the advisor's advice, their consult, essentially, he divorced her and said she would never be allowed to come into his presence before. Now, I don't know how offensive he was or whatever else that he did, but she is giving up a very high position of power. Now, granted, she did what the king said, but these queens had people waiting on them hand and foot. They could throw their own banquets. They could do that kind of stuff. And apparently that's what she was doing, was having a banquet when he was having a banquet over there for the women, and that may have been part of the reason she chose not to come. All that's gone. All her power and her authority are gone because she chose not to come when the king said so. Esther 2:8. Could I have somebody read that for me, please? 2:8, please.
So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women.
Thank you, sir. As part of the advice of his counselors and everything, it said, do away with her, don't let her come in your presence again, but send down into the whole kingdom and have the most beautiful virgins brought to the palace here. They will then go through beauty treatments and be brought before the king for him to choose which one he wants as his new queen. The king, per tradition at that time, he had a harem. He had a bunch of women at his beck and call. Many young women throughout the kingdom, though, were brought in. The most beautiful virgins, is what Scripture said, were gathered together and brought to the palace. One of these women was a woman named Esther. Scripture tells us that Esther had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. Scripture indicates that she first pleased Haggai, keeper of the women. Okay, now guys, before you go off and get half cocked and say, what a job, the keeper of the women, you have to remember that usually the keeper of the women was one of the eunuchs. So when I discussed eunuch before, yes, they were keeper of the women. They protected them, they served them and everything else. But usually they were men, that term also refers to men who had been castrated. Because if you're the king and you're going to put a man in charge of all these beautiful women, how are you going to trust them with all these beautiful women? Take that desire, that ability away from them. So a eunuch also referred to a person as being castrated. So guys, before you sign up to be the keeper of the women, you might want to think about that choice, that career choice there. Anyway, Esther was one of the women that was brought to the palace for the king to preview, whatever you want to call it, to determine which one he wanted. Anyway, when Esther was brought to him, brought to the harem, apparently she made an impression on him. Now, I have to think, now again, if you will, I don't want to say extra biblical, but there's nothing that says much about Esther's personality yet at this point. But the most beautiful women from throughout the kingdom are being brought and put in this man's care. But it says that Esther made an impression on him. Scripture says that he thought well of her and that the young woman pleased him and gained his favor. So of all these beautiful women, it would kind of indicate that there was something unique about Esther that stood out. Because like I said, he had the most beautiful women of the kingdom brought in there, but she apparently stood out. So Haggai, the keeper of the women, accelerated the beauty treatments that the women underwent. He also gave her the best food at the time to make her even more impressive. He also assigned 7 women to specifically take care of her, get her ready, and moved her to the best quarters in the harem. Scripture indicates that this part is incredible. It says that each woman was given at least 6 months of treatment with oil of myrrh, and then 6 months of treatment with perfumes and cosmetics before she had her turn to be brought before the king. Guys, I thought it took my wife a long time to get ready to go out to dinner. A year of beauty treatments of different types before she was brought before the king for his approval. Now, slight diversion here, kind of glanced over. Esther was an orphan, and she had been cared for her entire life by her cousin Mordecai. He had, according to Scripture, actually adopted her, if you will. We don't know a whole lot about Mordecai either, except Scripture tells us over and over again that he would sit at the king's gate. Now, that's not like a beggar sitting at the gate of Jerusalem type of thing. Apparently, there was some clout there. This was no simple thing. It indicated, because of where he sat, that he was one of the counselors, one of the officials of the court, because that's where he stayed. This gate was not a gate like just open and closed gate. When they refer to the king's gate in Susa, historically, this was a huge structure. The gate entrance itself, it was 131 feet by 92 feet and had column-like towers on each corner that were 40 feet high. So it was more of a service location than just an entrance to the grounds there, the palace grounds. So the King's Gate literally was a title, not just a gate coming in there. And apparently Mordecai sat at the King's Gate on a regular basis. Staying at the King's Gate did a couple of things. Like I said, one, it indicated that he had some position with the court, because otherwise he wouldn't be allowed to, because there were actually rules about staying at the King's Gate, which we'll discuss here in a second. But it also allowed Mordecai to hear about and keep tabs on Esther once she was brought into the harem. Now, Scripture does not indicate that there was direct communication, like she would get up and walk out and go stand at the gate and talk to Mordecai or anything like that, but it says messengers went back and forth, and he was likely able to glean news about Esther and how things were going on with her time there, and he would message her. Later on in Scripture, he does. So when it was Esther's turn to be brought before the king, Scripture says that she gained favor in the eyes of everyone that saw her before even coming before the king. Can somebody read Esther 2, verse 17 for me? Esther 2:17.
The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins. He placed a royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti.
Of all the women that were there, she won favor, and Scripture literally tells us, as Blaine just read, that the king loved Esther more than any of the other women. He chose her to be queen, placed a crown on her head, threw a banquet in her honor. Now, Scripture indicates that Esther had still not revealed her ethnicity, but Scripture also does not indicate that there was any point of discrimination from the king himself. Nothing is said that he was anti-Jew, anti-Semite, I guess is the term that we use so much these days. But she had not revealed her identity apparently to anybody in the court yet. Now, there were likely, because of where she had been brought in from, there were probably some of the servants that may have known, but there's nothing to indicate that the king or his court actually knew her ethnicity. Scripture actually says that Mordecai had told her not to reveal her ethnicity, and she obeyed his commands, and Scripture says, as she always had. So like I said, he had adopted her, and like a father, she did exactly what Mordecai told her to. And Mordecai had told her not to tell anybody what it was, or what her ethnicity is. Can I have somebody read verses 20 and 21 for me? I'm sorry, of chapter 2. Yep.
Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai.
Go ahead and read the last one, 23, if you would. I'm sorry.
When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king.
So Esther becomes queen, excuse me. It's not modern times where they did that. Esther becomes queen. Mordecai still sitting, residing, whatever you want to call it, spending his time at the king's gate. And like I said, that's an official title of that huge structure that I described. And then in 3 verses, something that I would have thought would be very critical, and actually does become more critical, is almost glanced over in the writing. It tells us in 3 verses that Mordecai was sitting at the gate, heard of 2 of the king's eunuchs, servants. Remember, it said also they're used as counselors sometimes and servants of the king himself, not necessarily just the queen. Said 2 of them became infuriated. We're going to assassinate the king. Mordecai tells Esther about it. I guess gets her a message somehow. We don't know. It just says that he relayed the information to Esther. Esther tells the king. The king investigates, finds it to be true, and kills him. In 3 verses, an entire plot of assassination of the king is discussed, discovered, persecuted, and done with. And except for the scripture says this event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence, it's almost like nothing else was ever noted about it. Nothing else was done, nothing else was said. Now, we will talk about this in just a minute because apparently it wasn't that rare in the king's position. I'm going to read Esther 3, 1 and 2. After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. I can't even say that word. It just doesn't roll. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. The entire royal staff at the king's gate, royal staff is at the king's gate. So again, this is not just a gate. This is a place where people stayed. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. We don't know a lot about Haman here. Doesn't tell us a whole lot except for the fact that he was the son of Agatite, however you pronounce that. As we read a little bit further, also learn that apparently he was an anti-Semite because he was definitely anti-Jews. There's nothing scripturally indicated that forbade Mordecai from bowing down and showing honor to the king or the courts. And the king had ordered that his officials would all bow down to Haman. The reason I say there's nothing in Scripture is this becomes an issue that he did not bow down to Haman, but there's nothing said that he didn't bow down to other officials that would have been instructed by the king. There's nothing that indicates that he wouldn't bow down to the king himself. So we don't know the total circumstances of that. Now, granted, I will tell you that Scripture does tell us not to worship anybody other than the one true God. And so it could be said that bowing down like that. Now, cultures are different. I spent 2 years, 3.5 months in Japan. That is a sign of respect but you're not going prostrate. You literally just kind of bow your head. When you greet people, it's showing respect to them. A lot of times when people leave rooms, they would do the same thing. So, I mean, I'm not getting into a debate over what is worshiping and what is just showing a respect to a person because of their position or something like that. It does worry me, and I know in the news, what was it, several years ago, some big deal was made of whether Biden or Obama, I can't remember which, bowed before the Saudi royalty, and I'm not going to argue over that. If I hear that you're saying prayers to them, okay, then we'll have a discussion about that. That's a little bit different. If you start worshiping them, that to me is not the same thing. But anyway, Mordecai refused to bow before Haman.
So you're saying, Dusty, that we're not to presume presume that he's not bound to anybody. All we know is he's not bound under this particular guy.
Correct. And Scripture makes a big deal out of the fact that he's not bound to Haman. We can't assume because, remember, we're not adds anything into Scripture. So we don't know whether he did bow to other officials and authorities. I guess that's what I'm saying. But a big deal is made out of the fact that he did not bow before Haman, even though the king had ordered it. This takes us a little bit back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where king's order was disobeyed. Now on that one, it wasn't just bow down. Remember, it says you were to worship the statue or whatever it was that the king had made. And then in Daniel, now granted the king was tricked there in the decree that you weren't to pray to anybody other than the king. But in some cases, in my opinion, it seems like these kings become so high, I won't say high and mighty as derogatory, but high and mighty, high and powerful, that they don't even realize what the people under them are sometimes doing. It definitely seemed that way with Darius, because after he found out what he'd essentially been tricked into signing, this edict, he was very upset about it. Scripture told us that. So it seems like these guys are given, and remember Haman, it says he was honored and he was put in a position over all the other officials. They're given a whole lot of clout, and the king's like, just handle it. And we'll see in here there's other cases where the king does the same thing. Yes, ma'am.
So it says Haman, the Agag, however you say that word. So if you take the ITE off, that's Agag. And that was one of the kings way back somewhere, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Against Israel.
We were about to get to that.
Sorry.
No, you're not doing, that was speculation.
Yes.
Okay, but we believe because historically this does indicate that Haman is a descendant of King Agag. If we don't remember, King Agag was king of the Amalekites, which Saul was told through the prophet to destroy, and he refused to, that particular king. So we don't know if there's leftover hostility between the Amalekites, i.e. Haman being a descendant of, because there's also scripture, and we do not know this for a fact, but there is scripture, historical information that indicates that Mordecai may have been a descendant of Saul himself. Kind of gives some credence to the fact of why there may be some, hostility between these two people, if they knew that for some reason.
Israel and Amalekites.
Correct.
So, and Malachi could have known, he's, maybe we don't know.
And or Saul.
Yeah.
And or Saul may, because it was more definitive as to who he was a son of or a descendant of than it was even Mordecai.
Right.
We don't know, like I say, for sure, but it says part of his title indicates he is definitely a descendant of the king of the Amalekites, because he's an Agatite, as you put it, if that's pronounced the correct way. So it may very well have given some of the, the credence and everything to that. We can't say for sure, but it sure seems like they had something against each other right off the bat. Now, people given power and given authority, when others don't honor and respect and show them that, sometimes that goes to their head. We have to be careful of that. Not that I've ever been in much of a position of authority, but it can go to your head. We see accounts of that all the time, particularly in history. Anyway, for some reason, the king had chosen to honor Haman. We don't know what else he had done, and placed him in a position over all these other officials. Like I said, scripturally, it seems like this may have went to his head because he wanted everybody bowing down before him, and he bragged about everything. Mordecai obviously felt otherwise. And scripture does tell us, again, doesn't tell us exactly why, but it does tell us that this enraged Haman, that Mordecai refused to bow down before him. Now remember, Haman was given a position of authority over all the other officials. You would think that he could just deal with Mordecai himself. But even in this position of authority, Haman was still apparently afraid to act unilaterally by just killing Mordecai. Again, Mordecai did sit at the king's gate, so it lends some credence to the fact that he had some official capacity there as well. So if one of the king's officials is unilaterally taking out another one of the king's officials, might bring up questions, and Haman may have been concerned about his position. Plus, I find it hard to believe that Haman, being placed over all the other officials and being there, would not be aware of the fact that even though the king did not make a big deal of it, yet realized that Mordecai had discovered this plot and had sent it through Esther about the fact that somebody was plotting to assassinate the king. So Haman may very well have been concerned, the guy that saved the king's life, and I'm just going to take him out because I'm mad because he won't bow down to me. So he had some concerns as to doing that. So instead, just like our plotters in the account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and even more so in Darius, he hatched a plot. He decided another way to do it. Haman, anyway, knew that Mordecai was Jewish. Apparently, there had been no discussion about Esther up to this point, but Mordecai was aware. Scripture tells us that Mordecai was Jewish, so he hatched a plot to take care of all the Jews. Again, because of his title, his name, we know that he was a descendant of the king of the Amalekites. So it may have been brewing hostility, and he saw a chance now that he's number 2 in command of the entire Persian Empire to deal with people that have been his sworn enemies, down throughout time. Esther 3, verses 8 through 11. Excuse me, I'll go ahead and read it for time. Then Haman informed the king, "There's one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate." That's what God told the Jewish people to do. "Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for deposit in the royal treasury." The king removed his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, anyway, the enemy of the Jews. Then the king told Haman, "The money and people are given to you to do with as you see fit." There's nothing in Scripture that indicates the king had anything against the Jews. He might not have even been aware. Now, what Haman did do is he started with the truth. There's a people that spread throughout your kingdom, which is true. They'd been brought over to that area of Babylon, which now it's the Persian Medes Empire, in exile, taken captive, and they had spread and some had stayed. They set themselves apart, which is what God tells the Jews to do. You are supposed to be my representative. You are to be my people, holy, which means set apart. But then he says that they don't obey the laws of the king. Now, there is nothing that indicates that they did not obey the laws of the king. So Haman starts with the truth, but then ends with a lie. But Haman followed up with an offer that probably would have swayed the king. Scripture, depending on which translation, says 10,000 talents of silver or 375 tons of silver. Now remember, as I mentioned before, the Medes and the Persians, the Persian Empire, whatever you want to call it, had apparently just historically just gone through a war or whatever you want to call it with the Greeks. So the coffers may have been down a little bit low. Well, looking back historically, that amount of money that Haman offered to put in the coffers of the Persian Empire apparently is about half of the income of the empire for a year. Half of their annual income. That's quite a bit of money to offer. Haman did not care much for the Jews, and it literally says right there, he said he gave the signet ring to Haman, son of the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So Haman was definitely an enemy of the Jews. Again, we don't know exactly why, if it's historically because of his descendancy or whatever, but he offered this money. The king offered Haman his signet ring, an official sign that the orders that he wrote up would come from the king. And essentially, it's like he didn't even care, because I don't think he realized, again, somewhat like Darius, exactly who all. And again, at this point, Esther had still not revealed her ethnicity. And so I don't believe the king had any, I'm not trying to write into it, nothing tells us that, but nothing indicates that the king was aware of Esther's ethnicity, and the fact of what Haman was about to do could be a death sentence for her as well, because the orders that he has drawn up with the authority of the king is to annihilate the entire Jewish population in the Persian Empire, including in Susa. Esther 3:13 says this. I got to find it. Letters were sent by couriers to each of the royal provinces telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people. young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. Okay, you're like, well, why did he pick it so far out? We don't know exactly how long that was, but it was not immediate, obviously, because the story continues. There weren't two-way radios at the time. The commander couldn't get on his radio and call all his, lieutenants or whatever you want to call it in all the regions and the districts and say, hey, we're doing this tomorrow. He had to send out couriers. There were no telegraphs. He had to send out word. And it may have been, truthfully, to prolong the agony, because Scripture tells us that the Jewish people mourned over the news because they became aware of it. I don't know about y'all, but when I was young and I got in trouble, first I had to sit through dinner with my dad boring holes in me because my mom had said, I lost my name, by the way, when I got in trouble sitting at the dinner table. I didn't have it anymore. It was, guess what your middle child did today? Somehow I no longer had a name. And so I ate with my head down, and knowing that my dad's eyes were boring into my head, and then after dinner he would tell me to go to my room and wait. That was the worst part of the punishment. Go ahead and spank me. Get it over with. Don't make me sit there and think about it. Now, I will say this. It was kind of like the king when he got upset at the queen. What was he going to do? He waited. He spoke to counselors. I learned later, and I respect my dad of all the things besides the fact that he was a godly example, not a perfect man, but he definitely loved Jesus Christ and demonstrated that to his whole family. But I also respected him because I found out later that's because my dad had a temper like mine. And so when he found out, he probably wanted to jerk me out of that chair right there and knock the snot out of me. But instead, he sent me to my room so that he could calm down and not do what he was going to do in anger. So when he came to punish me, it was discipline. It was not him striking out in anger. And I respect my dad for that so much. But it doesn't change the fact that sitting in that room waiting and hearing them footsteps coming was horrendous. I hated it. So I don't know, but I know it was tough on the Jews. It says so in Scripture. So Haman picked a day, the 13th day of Adar, which was the 12th month. Again, there's no reason, there's nothing given as to why he delayed it this long. But we're talking about knocking out and annihilating an entire population. It's not something I've ever thought about, but you tell, say, the governor of a city, a mayor of a city, okay, go, I'm sorry, I'm just speaking, go kill all of this one particular population, whatever it may be. You can't just do that. You have to make some plans. You have to have forces in place, because I don't think they're going to sit there and just bend over and take it and let you put a sword to the back of their neck or whatever. I'm not going to anyway. I might lose, but I'm going to go down fighting. Plans had to be put in place. So it may have been also to allow them time to put plans in place to annihilate the entire Jewish population, men, women, young and old, it says. Either way, all the Jewish people learned of the plan and mourned, with many wearing sackcloth and ashes. Sackcloth and ashes is something traditionally, again, that is spoken of when people are mourning, they're suffering, they're expressing their hurt, their internal hurt. And Mordecai himself also heard of the plans and also mourned and wore sackcloth, a detail at the king's gate. Because tradition says, Scripture tells us that they were not allowed to wear sackcloth and ashes into the king's gate. So apparently it was at the king's gate, not into the king's gate. Now, I had never thought of this before, but there was a law in place to prevent people from coming in wearing sackcloth and ashes. So apparently it happened frequently enough that they had to put a law in place. You sit there and you go through our laws, and we used to say this at the sheriff's office. You'd go through our written directives and our operational orders, and it's like, that's silly. Why is that even written? It had happened before. There was a reason there was a written directive put in place or an operational order put in place, because it had to have happened before. And we used to joke, literally, somebody would do something so stupid and they would literally almost immediately send down an updated, it would amend one of our operational orders, and we'd call that, whoever the person was, we call that his order or his amendment, because he was the one that was dumb enough that did whatever it was that mandated a change. Well, this had happened. there were enough accounts of it that a law had been put in place. He only went as far as to the king's gate, as law prohibited anyone from entering the king's gate wearing the sackcloth, as I said. Esther heard what Mordecai was doing and first sent clothes so that he would put them on and not get in trouble. I don't know if Mordecai was pushing the limit, it says he went to, it does not say that he went in, and with the law, I think that probably would have given Haman another excuse to deal with it if there was a law in place, if he was actually in the king's gate wearing sackcloth and in ashes. But Esther, like I said, even if they weren't directly communicating, he could keep track of her. Well, apparently she was keeping track of him as well, because Scripture tells us that Esther heard that Mordecai was in sackcloth and ashes at the king's gate, and she initially sent clothes trying to get him to dress in clothes so that he would not get himself in trouble. Scripture says that she was in fear for him. When he did not put the clothes on, she then sent one of her assigned eunuchs to inquire of Mordecai exactly what he was doing and why. Mordecai sent word back to her exactly what Haman had signed. By the way, in my notes I put singed instead of signed. Exactly what Haman had signed, the order, what that meant with the king's authority, and it says that he also told her how much money had been offered by Haman into the king's coffers for him to be able to accomplish this. But it also says that he sent a copy of the king's decree so that she could see this. But he went a step further as well. Esther 4:8 says, Mordecai also gave him, the messenger, this is a copy of the written decree issued in Susa, ordering their destruction, so that the messenger, Hathach was his name, might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king, implore his favor, and plead with him personally for her people. Now, a couple of things here. One, it says that the messenger was to take this to Esther, explain it to her. Now, there are biblical scholars so much more smarter than me that have had discussions about exactly what that meant. Even early in our history, the common people did not necessarily educate. So there are some that speculate that Esther could not read. There's also those that speculate because of different languages that it may have had to have been translated into Aramaic, which is what the Jewish people was their common language of that time, so it may have had to have been translated. It also could have been legalese, because we have attorneys for a reason, because the average person doesn't understand. How many of y'all buy something and then you get this 50-page document that you're agreeing to and actually read it? Mark might would. He's the type that might would. Instruction manual. That's what you go to when something goes wrong, right? I mean, you don't. Yes, exactly.
Instructions after you destroyed it.
Exactly. But seriously, if it's written in their legalese at the time, it's entirely possible that she wouldn't understand that. Well, these eunuchs, remember, were servants of the king as well as of the women, so they probably had more. I won't say education, but smarts, understood more than even the queen would have, so probably need, all of us, we have our fields, that we're comfortable with, and you step outside and it's like, I got no idea, I'm calling somebody else, and that would be, an attorney for this legalese. The second thing, though, I want to point out is that Mordecai told her, explain it to her, command her to approach the king, implore his favor, and plead with him personally for her people. What has changed here?
Now he wants her to tell of her ethnicity.
I'm sorry?
So now he wants her to tell of her ethnicity.
Exactly. Up till now, she, at Mordecai's order, had not told anybody what her ethnicity is. Now, I don't question the Bible, because obviously God's hand is in all of this, but do you think if the king knew Esther's ethnicity before Haman got mad and went to him for this order, do you think maybe all this would have been avoided? Because I don't think Haman would have had the guts to go to the king and say, hey, let me kill all the Jewish people if he knows that the queen is Jewish. Now, would Haman have tried to do something else? Again, all speculation, but it does kind of make you curious. But God's hand is in all that. That is one thing that we definitely know about it. It's kind of noticeable that Mordecai refers to the Jews as her people when he's ordered her up to this point not to even disclose her ethnicity. Esther 4:10 through 12. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai All the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned: the death penalty, unless the king extends the gold scepter, allowing that person to live. I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. Mordecai has a position in the court, apparently, whether it be an official, whatever. He would have been aware of that law. You don't see him going up saying, hey, I saved your life, I'm a Jew, can you do something about this to the king? Instead, he goes to the queen, which the queen probably, it's like, going to the wife, hey, can you have some influence? I will say this, I don't remember who it was, but when we hadn't been coming to this church long, and I hope that's changed, and I hope it was just an over-exaggeration, but we hadn't been coming to this church long, and somebody went to Maria and said, you need to tell Dusty to do ... She looks at him, do you even know my husband? I listen to my wife, but I don't take people telling me what to do very well. Ask me. I'll do almost anything in the world for you. I don't know why. That is something that I grew up. My parents would even say, hey, would you go? Now, that wasn't a request, but they phrased it like a request. And so I don't like people telling me what to do. Like I said, I don't know why. It scrapes down my back. Ask me, I'll do anything in the world for you. But here in this case, Mordecai tells her what to do instead of going before the king himself. Esther's response to Mordecai through Hathach was to remind him that to come to the king unbidden was certain death. Now, I explained a little bit of this before and said that we'd go into it in a little more detail. Esther had not been summoned, she said, for over 30 days. I'm like, I understand that a king's got a little bit of power and he's kind of proud of himself and everything. But what's the big deal of, he's got people around him. It's not like he should be in danger. So what's the big deal? Why is this law in place? Remember what we discussed before, that there were 3 verses that discussed a plot to assassinate the king? It was discovered, it was examined, proved to be true, and the 2 people responsible for it were killed, and nothing else is said of it. Apparently, assassination attempts of the kings of that time was not rare. It had happened before. Oh, and by the way, this particular king is killed in his bed 10 years later. Assassinated. So, if I'm the woman in charge, I don't have a Secret Service, but you know what? I probably could order to have that perimeter set up and nobody comes into that perimeter without me saying so. And a law had been put in place that if you came into the inner court without being summoned, it was a sentence of death, unless, in other words, you had the king's favor enough and he pointed the golden scepter at you. The law was understandable in the context of that time. The messengers delivered the message to Mordecai, and his response is one of the most well-known statements, I would say, in the Old Testament, not only in Esther. We use this quite often as well. 4 verses 13 and 14. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. We are definitely going to run over a little bit today, so hold on. I'm going to try to go through it quickly. Mordecai at this point reminds her that she is a Jewish person and will not necessarily be spared herself because the order is supposedly not, remember we discussed last week, when an edict is issued in the Medes and Persian law, it was not to be circumvented. But he points out that deliverance will come to the people by some format, but he points out that maybe she'd come to this position for such a time as this. I have years back struggled with trusting God to take care of my kids when they started going out on their own. This is an evil world, and I worried so much about them. And God came to a point where he told me, not only, do you think I need you to take care of my children? Because those are my children before they're your children. I've given you the privilege of raising them, but they're mine. And he gave me that first. But when I look at this evil world and that my kids are raising kids in this evil world, this scripture comes to mind. I know that God has placed us and my family in this world for such a time as this. And I don't know what God's going to do with them, but it gives me such reassurance when God reminds me of that He's in charge, I'm not in charge. I can't protect my family anyway, especially when they move to Washington and Indianapolis. But He has placed them where He has placed them for such a time as this. Now, one unique thing about the book of Esther that we're going to discuss real quick, and then we'll go on. Esther is saved, by the way, in case we kind of get caught up in the live stream. Two things that Mordecai does here. He says that God's people, the Jewish people, will be delivered even if you don't do what I'm telling you you should do. That's number one. But he also says we're put in a place that we are for a reason. Why does he say these two things? What gives him this reassurance? Does he say because God's in charge? Does he say because God's in control and I know that God placed you here? Got a question for you. Where do you see God in the book of Esther?
It's not mentioned.
I'm sorry?
It's not mentioned.
The only book in the Bible that God is never mentioned. Now, I defy you to tell me that God is not alive and present in everything that is going on there, including Mordecai and Esther's life and the people, his people that he's taking care of. But it is the only book in the Bible that God is not mentioned. Mordecai doesn't directly mention it, but it sure indicates that he has faith and trust in a God who's going to deliver his people because they are God's people. The Jewish people are his chosen people, and that God puts us in the positions that we're at for a reason. Esther 5, 1 through 4. On the third day, Esther dressed in her royal clothing and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing it. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal courtroom facing its entrance. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she gained favor with him. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther, and she approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What is it, Queen Esther? The king asked her, whatever you want, even to half the kingdom will be given to you. If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for them. She appears before the king, and we're going to speed this up real fast. The king extends his scepter, saves her life. He is so enamored by her, she has gained his favor so much, he says, tell me what you want. Even to half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you. Now, most scholars indicate this is probably an exaggeration, but it is the king expressing how much he cares for her and how he would do almost anything for her. She says, just come to a banquet with Haman. When they're at the banquet, the king again asked her what she desired, and she asked if once more the king and Haman would come to a banquet the next day that she would prepare for them. After the banquet, Haman left so happy because he is so important that the queen is inviting nobody but the king and him to this banquet. Oh, he is so full of himself at this point. I am so important. Maybe she even likes me. Who knows? But it says he went away happy until he got to the king's gate. And there's Mordecai again, not bowing down to him. And it says he's so infuriated. He goes home. He calls together friends. He calls together his wife. What should I do about this Jewish man? I know I'm having them all killed at a certain date, but this man's about to drive me crazy. And they say build this huge gallows and have him hanged the next day. And then go to the banquet. What a way to start your day. So he says, hey, good idea. So he has a huge gallows built, apparently, at his own property. Goes to the palace the next day with the intent of going before the king and asking him to allow him to hang Mordecai on these gallows. But something apparently else happens. Apparently the king had not rested well that night. And so, like us, if you are having a hard time going to sleep, what do you sometimes do?
Read a book.
Read a book. You pull out something, and usually something boring helps to get you tired to go to sleep. Well, he apparently starts reading his own diaries, the chronicles that are placed there. And he comes across this place where it was documented, and Scripture told us it was written in there, that this man Mordecai had told the queen, who had then told the king about a plot against his life, and he goes to his counselors, well, what did we ever do for Mordecai, this man that saved my life? Well, nothing. And he's like, man, I can't believe this. We did nothing. Remember I told you how important this really was, but it seemed like it was gleaned over back then and nothing was done. And the king says, man, I got to do something. I'm going to ask one of the court officials what I should do. So guess who happens to be walking through the front of the palace apparently at that time? Haman. But before he gets to express his request to the king says, Haman, if there's somebody that I really want to honor and show honor to, what should I do? And Haman, remember coming off this high the night before, coming from the banquet, going to another banquet with just the king being invited by the queen, figures it's me he wants to honor. He says, what I would do is I would take a horse that you'd ridden out of the royal livery there and put him on that. I would take a royal robe that you had worn and put it on him as well. I would parade him through the streets and have people calling out, this is what the king does for someone that he wants to honor. Because Haman's thinking, this is me. And he's wrong. The king says, I like that idea. Haman, go get Mordecai from the king's gate and do exactly that for him. Can you imagine?
And you parade the horse.
Exactly. That's why I said, you do this for him. Can you imagine? Talk about 180 degrees. The man that he hated, that he loathed, that it says it drove him crazy, drove him to rage, drove him to anger, is a man that he then has to put on a horse, parade him through the streets, calling out, this is what the king does for a man that he wants to honor. Man, I can't even imagine that. The king told Haman to go ahead and do it, and he did exactly what the king told him, because if not, he'd be executed. And he is so infuriated, he goes home again to his friends and his wife and says, guess what happened? And you know what they say this time? You've already been humbled before a Jew. It's done for you. You'll never recover. It's over for you. Oh, and by the way, with that news, the servants are at the door to take you to the banquet with the king and the queen. So he doesn't have any time to even process what had happened. Esther 7, verses 3 and 4. I know I'm running over. We'll wrap up real quick. Queen Esther answered, again, going to the banquet. The king asked her again, what can I do for you, even to half my kingdom? Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if the king is pleased, spare my life. This is my request. And spare my people. This is my desire. For my people and I have been sold to destruction, death, and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept silent instead of troubling the king, because it wouldn't be worth burdening the king about it. She goes to the king and she says, spare my life, allow me to live and my people, because how would I live if my people are killed and I live? The king gets infuriated. Who did this? The enemy, Haman, is the one that did this. And remember, like I said, like my dad used to do, apparently the king had done when he got upset at Vashti, apparently he jumps up, leaves the room, it says, and goes into the gardens to contemplate what to do to Haman. Haman is stupid. Talking about pouring coals on the fire. Apparently while the king's out in the garden, he throws himself at Esther's feet. King comes back in and sees Haman apparently on the couch, bowing down to her, begging, but he does not aware of that. And he's like, you're going to violate the queen while I'm still in the palace? What am I going to do with him? Counselor's like, oh, hey, guess what? There's a gallows in his yard. It literally says a gallows at Haman's house. Hang him from it. So they took him out and hung him from it. And again, pushing the story forward, remember, Matthew 7, 9, and 10, at the garden when Jesus, this is 26:52, at the garden when Jesus is betrayed by Judas, Scripture tells us that Peter drew a sword, remember, and cut the ear off, and it doesn't say that in Matthew, it says a servant, but other Scripture tells us it was Peter, drew a sword and cut the ear off of one of the priest servants. Jesus says in Matthew 26-52, Jesus told him, put your sword back in its place, because all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. He was so infuriated, he was so angry, he hated Mordecai so much that he was going to have him hung, and instead he ends up hanging from his own gallows. What Haman had planned for Mordecai and all the Jews simply because of a power trip had come full circle and ensnarled him in his own trap. All in the same day, Haman was forced to honor Mordecai, went to the second banquet in charge of trying to kill the queen and her people, and was hanged. The theme of this reversal also carries on into chapter 8 because Haman's estate is awarded to Esther. And she places Mordecai in charge of Haman's estate. Man, if you could look back 2020 or hindsight, man, just the change, the way that God worked. But Esther was pleased with the king's orders, but again, she goes to him and says, but my people are going to die because of the order that was already issued. Now, it does not say that this order was reversed, because remember, it says in the law, an edict is issued and